Welcome and good morning to everyone. In this video, I hope to share with you some basic as well as unusual reflections on the Israel-Hamas conflict raging in Gaza. One of the features of this event of global significance is the growing dichotomy or the growing contrast between Israel's view of the situation or Israel's view of what it is out to achieve through this Gaza operations and the response of the rest of the world, barring a few pockets of settled Israeli support. Signs are quite evident that Israel is suffering increasing global alienation. As I predicted in one of the videos on the subject I posted nearly 20 days ago, the final outcome, the only outcome of this military enterprise is that Israel will be isolated, or Israel will suffer isolation in the global community, and Jews all over the world will be targeted. And therefore, the consequences of this conflict will not end. It certainly will not end in our lifetime. The Jews will lose far more than they will gain through this enterprise. In saying so, I'm not blaming everything on the Jews. I'm only saying that historical realism tells me that the outcome will be unthinkably unpleasant and unprofitable for the Jews. Perhaps the Jews as a race are regressing back to the pre-1948 days of their global diasporic dispersion and multiple disabilities. Now, what is the root problem here? Can this problem be settled? Suppose Israel stops the war now in deference to the global opinion out of humanitarian considerations in order to prove that the Jews also have a heart. Suppose Israel chooses to do that. Do you really believe that that is the end of the matter? The Jews are pretty clear on this, and here intellectually I agree with them. Morally I don't, but intellectually I agree with them. They're suspending the operations now without attaining their declared intention of disinfecting the Gaza Strip of the Hamas nuisance, in their opinion. It's a terrible mistake. That's what the Jews really believe. And historical realism is on their side, because if they abandon this present enterprise halfway or less than halfway, all that will result from this sentimental choice will be the further institutionalization of extreme organized violence against the Jewish state. Israel will have to live in chronic states of national insecurity. And the Palestinians on the side, led by the Hamas, will conclude that it is their birthright as well as national duty to never let Israel live in peace. Palestinian heroism will consist entirely of bleeding the Jews as routinely and regularly as they can. I find it hard to believe that this is peace. Actually, if you look at the history of this strip of land, this area, from 1948, this region has been at war from 1948. Cessation of war or cessations of war were mere interludes between wars. Unfortunately, the great pundits of the world are ignoring this reality. There is an important truth that emerges, as far as I am concerned, from this recognition that this region never knew peace. It only knew periodic suspensions of military operations and active bloodletting hostilities. That's all that this region knew. It never knew peace. In other words, the politics of this region is cast entirely in the mode of insecurity and not of peace. Now, this is a very major theme. I'll do a separate video on this very soon. Two entirely different paradigms. One is security and the other is peace. On the face of it, you would think that these two are compatible. They're incompatible. If you think in terms of security, you will see everyone else except your own people as your enemies. But if you think in terms of peace, this perspective changes very radically. Then your priorities, your strategies, the way you understand yourself and others will all change. Unfortunately, human nature has been conditioned to think in terms of security, insecurity, rather than peace and coexistence, cooperative coexistence. We are unschooled, we are illiterate in respect of peace. We are all PhDs in respect of violence, hatred, warmongering. For example, if there are two lectures in two adjoining venues, between which you can easily choose, one on war, the other on peace, please ask yourself, which lecture will you attend? Our nature has been attuned to romanticizing war making. Our heroes are not heroes of peace, our heroes are heroes of war. The greats of history are experts in warmongering. Alexander the Great, what was great about him? He was the reason lakhs and lakhs of people perished. Napoleon the Great, what was his greatness? Millions perished. Charlemagne the Great, Peter the Great, and as some people would say, for example, the RSS people in India, Hitler the Great. Human greatness in history is understood only on the scale of the capacity to shed blood or the capacity to inflict pain, destruction and death. This is another subject, and for the time being, I will only say this much. So, time has come to realize that the Israeli-Palestine issue or the Palestinian question, as of now, in the present form, is insolvable. It cannot be solved in the manner in which it is understood and approached today. My main reason for saying this is that this two-nation theory is simply unsustainable. It has nothing to do with the factual realities of this context. To understand this, all you have to do is to look at the state of Palestine, the predicament of the Palestinians. They are all squeezed up in this very small patch of territory, about 360 square kilometers. 2.3 million people live there. and the land is not such that it can produce what it takes to feed and sustain a population of that kind, and secondly, that population is expanding very fast. For example, 50% of the Palestinian population is young people below the age of 18. It's a demographic wonder, which means that the population of Palestine is expanding exponentially. Now, that in itself is not a bad thing. What makes it nightmarish is the fact that this very large astronomical expansion of the population within this very constricted geographical area is simply explosive. So, the Palestinians will have the irresistible need to attack. They need more land, they need more property. What's happening? Israel is taking what little land that they have. And that's a settlers' violence issue. Israeli settlers' violence, which continuously plagues the western part, which is under PLO. So it is unsustainable. Now, in this process, what happens is, once there is a need to resort to violence chronically, there is also the need to distort each other's image. Therefore, in the eyes of the Jews, the Palestinians are always a danger. They are not human. So when people talk about human rights and humanitarian considerations for the Palestinians, the simple fact, which is not stated by anyone, is that the Jews do not understand, they cannot understand it. The Jews simply don't understand that the Palestinians are entitled to human rights, or that humanitarian consideration should apply to them. They don't believe this. And I can understand why. It is not right. It's absolutely unacceptable. It's wrong. It's condemnable. But I can understand why. Because that's the only climate of opinion which prevails there. And that climate of opinion cannot be changed. Nobody can do it. Neither America nor Iran can change it. That climate is now autonomous. It has assumed a life of its own. So, in this context, in order to understand this situation better, it's perhaps useful to go back a long time to a Greek thinker called Aristotle. And for the next 5, 6 minutes, 10 minutes, I'll share some insights from Aristotle, which is very relevant to the Palestinian question and this explosive politics which threatens to subvert the global order. We understand the situation better if we look far away from it and derive some insight from another source. So let me share a few sentences from Aristotle's classic work titled Politics. By the way, there are 2 books by Aristotle. One is Ethics and the other is Politics. Actually, Aristotle wanted to write only one book, and Ethics was the first part and Politics was the second part. But as he wrote, his ideas expanded and he realized that both cannot exist together as one book. Therefore, he split it into 2. Therefore, if you want to understand politics, you have to read Ethics first. But what I'm going to read out from Politics, the second book of Aristotle, second of the 2 books, can be understood because these are global principles which are directly relevant to the Palestinian question. So let's straight away read. I'll read from the text and then I offer 1 or 2 explanations. So text is self-explanatory, therefore I may not have to even offer any comment. I just read. The object of military training. Now, you know that for every citizen in every Greek city-state, particularly Athens and Sparta, military training was an important part of the training of the youth. So, the object of military training should be not to enslave persons who do not deserve slavery. So, first of all, Aristotle assumes that some people deserve to be slaves. Their nature is such that they can only be slaves. That was an article of belief widely endorsed by all Athenians and in fact also people of Sparta, right? So do not enslave. The purpose of military training is not to enslave those who do not deserve to be slaves, but firstly to secure ourselves against becoming slaves. Why should we fight? Not because we want to enslave anybody else, but because we don't want to be slaves. If you don't fight, you will become a slave. So it's not that I want to fight, but that if I don't fight, I'll end up as somebody else's slave. And therefore, I must train myself to fight, and I must defend my slavery with defend my freedom, and defend my freedom against slavery with my sword. Today, of course, not sword, but my gun. So should not be the purpose of fighting is not to enslave persons who do not deserve slavery, but firstly to secure ourselves against becoming the slaves of others. Secondly, to seek imperial power not with a view to universal despotic authority. We need imperial power, which means power that results from conquering others. That is imperialism, right? So we need imperial power not with a view to universal despotic authority, not to tyrannize over others. Then why do we need imperial authority or imperial power? But for the benefit of the subjects whom we rule. It's good for them that they are under our authority. It is good for them that we exercise control over them. It is good for them that they are our slaves. Good thought, no? The highest pinnacle of thought in the greatest of cultures known in history. It's good that they are our slaves. It's good for them, not for us. It's good for them that they are our slaves. But for the benefit of the subjects whom we rule. And thirdly, to exercise despotic power over those who are deserving to be slaves. So you must exert and exercise despotic power, rule with an iron fist over those who deserve to be slaves. This is precisely how the Jews look at the Palestinians. That's pretty clear. I don't endorse it, but I'm just describing the reality to you, which nobody else will. Okay. That the legislator should rather make it his object so to order his legislation upon military and other matters as to promote leisure and peace is a theory borne out by the facts of history. So what should the legislature do? The army, of course, should fight and conquer others so that it's good for them that we are their rulers, and it also will make sure that we don't end up as somebody else's slave. We have all the qualities to exercise despotic authority over others because we are far superior. We are the chosen race of God, right? At the same time, the legislators, the lawmakers have a duty, and that is they must maximize the leisure and quality of life of their own people at the expense of others. My dear friend, this is precisely what keeps the pot boiling. From the perspective of the Jews, it is right and proper that they constrict the Palestinians and view them as a perpetual thorn on their sides. And therefore, the Jews have come to the conclusion, and that conclusion has been forged in the furnace of this chronic warfare that erupted the day the Jewish state was formed in 1948, about which I have already made a mention in a previous video, 4th of August 1948. From that moment onwards, this region has been a flashpoint. So from that time onwards, the Jews have concluded that even for them to survive, it's necessary that they exercise brutal control over the region. But this predicament, the international community does not understand. The Jewish problem, from the Jewish perspective, is not understood and endorsed by the international community, except a few friends of the Jews, for prominent among them being America. And America itself is doing because of domestic compulsions and maybe partly religious sentiments. Now, while this goes on the other side, there's a different perspective. The Palestinians are squeezed dry. They are exploited. They are driven here and there like cattle. After all, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homeland or their territory when the Jewish state was carved out in 1948. They are refugees. And of the 2.3 million people now living in Gaza, a majority are the people who are descendants of the refugees from the land that they owned. So from their perspective, they have a moral right and a political obligation to bleed Israel. They have a need to annex more territory from Israel because it is very obvious, and I fully empathize with this. A Palestinian state as it is unsustainable unless the rest of the nations of the world pledge themselves to feeding the Palestinians and ensuring quality of life by making a regular, committed annual donation for their upkeep. Their food, their water, their electricity, everything has to be brought in from outside. And this population is growing. It's unsustainable. So, I don't see the end of the tunnel, to tell you the truth. Maybe there will be a truce, but the problem will not be settled. So there will not be peace, there will be an armistice, which is a temporary suspension of hostilities, which is what we have seen from 1948. Wars will not end here because the geopolitical situation is necessarily inhospitable to peace. In other words, the situation will make wars chronic. You can talk about peace, but if you don't examine conditions that are necessary and basic to the settlement of peace, then you're being very naive, you're being indeed irresponsible, you're keeping a generation, a whole people or two different peoples in a state of unending war and bloodletting, terrible criminal waste of resources, and the subjection of millions of people to psychological distress. In fact, the post-traumatic stress that the Jews and the Palestinians have suffered and will continue to manifest in the near future is another horrendous prospect which nobody is talking about. I feel sorry. I feel unbearably sorry, both for the Palestinians and for the Jews. Their predicament is unthinkable. And adopting a simplistic, sentimental, naive view of the matter doesn't help. If this problem is to be solved, let me now tell you very boldly something that nobody will accept. If this problem is to be solved at all, there's only one way to solve it. One of the two parties should be shifted. Take a country like Canada. 85% of the land of Canada is still uninhabited. Now, carve out 1,000 square kilometer area. Canada will lose nothing. The rest of the nations of the world should pay for it, buy it out of Canada. Pay them whatever it takes, the land value. Instead of the 365 square kilometers that the Palestinians have today, create a Palestinian state of 1,000 square kilometers or 2,000 square kilometers, making sure that this is sustainable and they can produce what it takes to sustain their population out of the soil of the land. resettle the Palestinians. All right, you don't want to resettle them. Carve out an appropriate state for the Jews. They're numerically far greater, about 4 times the Palestinian strength. No, 5 times the Palestinian strength. Move one of these warring parties out. It is unsustainable. This region cannot support the 2 states. And those who are talking about the 2-nation theory are completely naive. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm sorry to say this, but it's a fact, and history will prove me right. Anyway, I offer these thoughts to you for what they are worth, for your consideration and continued reflection. Thank you for your kind attention.